worshiping together, opening up God's Word. If you would, please turn to Luke 23. Luke 23, that's going to be the chapter we're going to be going through tonight, or this morning. Luke 23, we're in Jerusalem. So we're finally in Jerusalem, and we're finally at the cross. This is coming to an end. It's culminating to the climax, which instead of being in the middle like we're normally used to, is here. So the way I split up this chapter is talking about the innocence of Christ on trial and the different rulings we see about this trial. So we're going to get different verdicts from different people. First, we're going to get it from the rulers of the people. We're going to get it from the crowd itself. Then we're going to have some rulings from Jesus about the people. And then rulings from criminals and witnesses and the disciples. And so that's how I decided to split up this chapter. And so we have this first section, and I'm only going to start off with the first 4 verses. So we're going to read the first 4 verses of chapter 23. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, saying, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." And they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching through all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." So we get to this guy named Pilate. And so far in the book of Luke, we've seen Pilate 2 other times. The first was in chapter 3 in the first verse, and it just said that he was the governor of this area. And the second was in 13, verse 1, and it was talking about this scene with Pilate, this scene that I think shows his character, where he steals money from the temple to build a cistern, and then the people protest. And so what he does is he has assassins hired out and to slaughter the people on his command. And so all we know from the book of Luke so far is that this guy has power and that he isn't afraid to kill people. And then we see Jesus finally standing before him, and he says he's innocent. He's innocent. But then we have these 3 charges, right? We have these 3 charges that the Jewish people bring before Pilate. And the way that the Jews had to bring these charges before a Roman official was to put it in a way that it mattered to them. That if it was a problem for the Jews, the Romans really didn't care, unless it was a problem for them. So the way that these charges are brought about is to make a problem for Rome. So the first one is misleading our nation. Pilate really doesn't seem too concerned about that. And then you have forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, which is completely false. If you remember back in chapter 20, he says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's." He explicitly states this, so this is just completely false. And then they say, he's saying he is Christ, a king. And this is the one that Pilate seems most concerned about. Is this guy trying to start a revolution? Is he going to create problems for me? And we'll see throughout this that Pilate's really concerned about himself. And we'll go a little bit more into maybe why that is. But how is this going to affect Pilate and his ruling and his problems? Is this going to make a problem for the Jews? And is this going to make a problem back at home with Rome? And so that is what Pilate is concerned about. And Pilate's ruling, what he decides, he stands, Jesus is before him, he says he's innocent. And normally Pilate isn't in Jerusalem. This isn't normal for him to be here. He's normally over in Caesarea, He's over in Caesarea, and he's in town for the Passover. And so what's happening here is he's trying to avoid political tension because these people are bringing, these important Jewish people, the Sanhedrin, are bringing Jesus to him. And then he's like, okay, what am I supposed to do? If I kill this guy, am I just killing him for no reason? But then I'm making these people mad if I'm not killing him. So he's kind of in like a pickle where he's trying to figure it out. And the reason that he's even more in a pickle, I think that we lose sometimes, is because of what's happening here. Quick history lesson. So if you remember Herod the Great, that's the guy who was in charge when Jesus was born. Herod the Great, he comes and he kills all those babies trying to kill Jesus and doesn't succeed. And then he dies shortly thereafter, and his ruling, his area, his land, goes to his 3 sons. So you have Herod Antipas, he gets Galilee, that's the yellow section up there. Then you have Philip, he gets the green section. And then you have this red section, and it goes to his 3rd son. And so yellow would be Herod Antipas. This is the guy who kills John the Baptist. He's the one who marries his brother's wife, Philip, the guy in the green. And then this third brother, he's the one who's given this ruling, but he's very harsh on the Jews. He's very harsh on them, and he has poor management skills. He doesn't really know how to navigate them well. And so because of a series of complaints that the Jews send to Rome, he gets removed and he gets exiled, and he's no longer over the land. And then you have this series of Roman officials that's put over the land that are listed out here. I'm not going to try to pronounce their names. And Pilate is the fifth of them. But if you'll notice the dates, this guy lasts 3 years, that guy lasts 4 years, 3 years. These people aren't lasting a long time. That there's constant just people cycling in and out. And so Pilate is trying to save himself from that, from being cycled out of this. This is really important that this happens. It's really important that Roman officials get over this land. Because of this, because they're over this land, 70 AD is able to happen because they're more involved in the land, they're more over it. It's not just a land that they're over, but a land that they're in. And so this leads way to 70 AD and some of the things that Stephen went over. But this is Pilate's rule. And so I hope that's helpful of why maybe this matters so much, is because that they're in the land. They're in the land, and Pilate's trying to save himself from being removed after these series of people are getting removed. Then you have Herod's ruling. So let's read verses 5 through 12. And they were urgent, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching through all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some signs done by him. So he questioned him at some length, and he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate, and Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that day, for before this they had been in enmity with each other. So we see this getting pushed off to Herod. So Pilate gets this difficult situation where he wants to be pleasing to the Jews. He's already made the Jews upset. The Sanhedrin, these important people that can send complaints and remove him from office, is coming towards him. And then they say, well, he's been doing this in your land, Judea, but he's also been doing this in Galilee. And so immediately Pilate's like, oh, I can push this off to someone else. And so that's what he does. He pushes it off to the other ruler, the guy that was in the yellow, Herod Antipas. So he sends him to Herod, who is also in Jerusalem because of the Passover. Again, he's from Galilee, so it doesn't really make sense he's here unless it's for the Passover. And so he's trying to keep the peace. He's trying not to cause problems with the Jews. He's trying not to cause problems with Herod because he's already upset at him for taking his brother's land and being involved in this anyway. And so he gets before Herod, Jesus does, and he sits there. And Herod seems like really happy. He's like a kid at like a circus. And he gets Jesus in front of him and he says, do tricks for me. You know, I've heard of these signs, do tricks for me. Do what I want you to do. He demands all these signs. And Jesus sits there in silence. He sits there in silence, and after the silence, they begin mocking him. They begin making fun of him, and eventually they dress him up in a royal garment and send him back away to Pilate. And so he comes to him joyfully, and he leaves mocking him. And he arrays him in the king, and then Herod and Pilate become friends. We see here that there's this kind of like circus monkey treatment. It's weird that he is glad to see Jesus, because back in chapter 13, the last time we hear about Herod around Jesus in this context is he wants to kill him. Like, Herod wants to kill Jesus, and then Jesus comes before him excited about these tricks, and so he wants him dead. And then after, like I said, he leaves, he's mocking him because he didn't get what he wants. Sometimes Jesus can come to us, and we can have this attitude of demanding that Jesus gives us what we want and what we think we need, And then when he doesn't give us what we want, we can start mocking him and having this terrible heart towards Jesus. And that's something we need to be mindful, is when we go before Jesus, we need to be mindful that when we don't get what we want, when God gives us what we need instead, that we're not having this poor attitude towards him. I'm going to ask you guys this question. We see with Jesus is before Pilate, he answers his question not in depth. He just says, as you have said, but he gives him an answer. But here instead, Jesus remains silent. So why do you think Jesus answers the question of Pilate, but not the question of Herod? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of it, is that Herod should have known better. Pilate, he's a Roman official, maybe has heard of Jesus in passing, but Herod should know better. He should be looking for the Messiah. He should be looking for this new king. Instead, he's not. He doesn't know better. And so there has to be some level of frustration. Anyone have anything else that they think? Cool. I think that's a major part of it, that he feels he should have known better. There's also this idea that John the Baptist came before Herod once before. So John the Baptist has come to Herod. He got killed for it. And so any truth that Jesus has to say to Herod, he's already heard before from John the Baptist. That you had closed ears then, and I don't think you'll be any different now. And then there's this final thing. I said this last time I taught, but I think we sometimes only put Jesus' frustrations or maybe his ability of power inside the cross itself, which I think has a place for sure. But imagine being here and you're standing before someone whose dad made you rip up your whole life and your whole family had to move down to Egypt because he was trying to kill you. And then he killed your cousin. And then he's not leading the people that you are love and are in charge of and want to bring to salvation, that this person is bringing them down in so many ways. And just being in the mind of Jesus, the level of self-control that had to go into this moment of being so frustrated at Herod himself. Go tell that fox is the last thing that we saw in Luke 13. And so we see this frustration that had to be building up, and he keeps silent, which I think is a good lesson of maybe when we have times where we can be frustrated and we can be fuming and we could go off on people, that maybe it's sometimes just better to remain silent. And so we see Herod here. Like I said, he's killed John the Baptist. He's led the people away from God. And still he's asking things of Jesus. He's asking things of Jesus. And so instead of apologizing like he should be, he instead is asking. And I think this is a good reminder for us that most of us struggle with different things in our prayer lives. Some people struggle with their whole prayers are just asking God for things. And some people struggle with the only time they go before God is when they're apologizing for actions they made. But we need to keep in mind that before we come to God asking for things, that we first need to make sure that we're right with our sin. That we don't need to be overlooking our sins and making Jesus our circus monkey and giving him a list of our demands. But instead, we need to be coming before him humbly, asking him, recognizing that we are sinners. And then we see Pilate and Herod. They become friends after this. Herod gives him the dress of a king, probably one of his old robes that he was going to get rid of anyway, and he dresses Jesus up in this way, and he sends him out. And if you remember, the Romans do this same thing in a different way. The Roman soldiers put a crown of thorns on his head, and they dress him in a purple robe, and they mock him, saying he's the king of the Jews. And I think a comment you can make from this is that the rulers of Jerusalem, or the rulers of the people at this time, the rulers of the Jews, aren't so different from the Romans. That they don't seem to be that different. That they're falling into the same traps, into the same sins. And that when we become like the world, we can be falling into these same traps, and we need to be mindful to become separate. This also creates peace between them. What creates peace and friendship between Pilate and Herod is mocking Jesus. And when we're thinking about our own friendships, we need to be thinking about what brings people together. What brings us together with other people? Is it mocking to Jesus? Is what brings you together with other people gossiping about people behind their back? Is it about sharing sins that you don't need to be doing in the first place? Is it saying, well, you can see what I'm doing in my life and I can see what you're doing, and I know we're both probably not in the place that we need to be, but like we both recognize that, so we're just not going to talk about it? Are we mocking to Jesus in our friendships, and is that what bringing us close together? Are we blessing him and exalting him in our friendships? And so finally we get to this section, I'm not going to read it, the 13 through 16, and Pilate says, I have found this man innocent. Herod has found this man innocent. Let's just punish him and then we can release him. We can punish this guy and then we'll release him. Let's just make everyone happy. Let's just be a compromise. But still, this is what he wants to do. This is showing the character of Pilate, that Pilate is merciless. Pilate is wanting to scourge an innocent man, someone he knows is innocent, has no problems, just for a compromise. He's very, very political. And then we have this next section here. I'm going to read 18 through 25. And this is the ruling of the crowd. The ruling of the crowd. But they all cried out together, away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection starting in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. But they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. Yes. A third time he said to them, why? What evil has he done? I found him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish him and release him. But they were urgent, demanding with loud voices, and he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed, so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they had asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And so we see this scene here where Pilate's like, I haven't found him wrong. Herod hasn't found him wrong. And so he's like, guys, let's just release him. And then they all start shouting together. I imagine if you guys were like all on the same mission and you guys all together started shouting at me, that'd be very intimidating. I would not enjoy that if you guys all started shouting the same thing at me. Even if I felt strongly convicted about something, there might be a temptation to break in that. And what Pilate tries to do, he seems strong, is he tries to go against this 3 separate times. But eventually he caves. He caves and gives them up to their will. He gives Jesus up to their will, and he decides to deliver him to be crucified. And the image that we get here between Barabbas and Jesus, who they want to release instead of Jesus, is this guy named Barabbas. And this name is super interesting, I think so at least, in that Barabbas, if you split it up, Bar means son, so like Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon son of Jonah, this is the son of, and then Abba, if you remember the song we sing sometimes, Abba, Father, Father, it means father. And so it's saying son of the Father. And what Barabbas is guilty of is insurrection and murder, this physical revolution. This is what they wanted Jesus to be. That Barabbas was the image of what they wanted Jesus to be. And so who's on trial is the people's image of who they thought the Christ would be and who the Christ actually is, and wanting to have a spiritual revolution instead. And we need to be asking ourselves, are we killing the Jesus that we have, are we killing the actual Jesus to keep alive this Jesus that we've created for ourselves? This Jesus that we want to be. That my Jesus would never want me to be uncomfortable or in a state like that, so I'm not going to do anything that's hard that he commands. Or my Jesus really doesn't like these people because I don't like these people, and so I'm not going to evangelize to them. I'm not going to reach out to them. I'll never talk to them about salvation or the Bible or Jesus himself. That we need to be careful that we're actually trying to follow and trying to worship the true Jesus, who Jesus is, the Jesus of the Bible. And then Pilate here, he tries to save them 3 times. That he tries to release Jesus 3 times. And this is an interesting contrast between him and Peter in this last chapter. That Peter denies Jesus 3 times, and Pilate here tries to save Jesus 3 times. But he fails. Ultimately, you can say he tried, but he fails. He gives them up to, he gives Jesus up to their will, and he delivers him to be crucified. And there's this classic point that I've heard from people, that are you trying harder than Pilate did to defend Jesus? And mind you, like everything we've gone over so far, like Pilate's not a good guy. That Pilate slaughters people in the towns. that Pilate is willing to scourge Jesus even though he knows he's innocent, that he's constantly mocking people, that Pilate is not a good person, but yet he still defends Jesus 3 times. In situations where everyone would be yelling at you and everyone would be against you, and you're standing alone and you have the power to stand up or not, are you? Are you trying harder than Pilate did? Because Pilate wasn't doing enough. I think another point to be made here is that we need to be weary of the crowd. That a lot of this was crowd influence, that the chief priests and the scribes and the religious leaders were bolstering up the crowd, and they started shouting all together. And when you're in a crowd, it can make you, in some ways, not sober-minded. That you can get into this mob mentality. There's this phrase my mom would always say to us: there's nothing more dangerous than a group of boys that have nothing good to do or nothing to do. And you can see this if you've ever seen like a middle school group of boys or high school group of boys, and they have nothing to do. That's when they start doing wrestling matches and they start playing tag in the dark, and things get broken and laid to waste. And the same thing can happen when you get a group of people together and they have nothing to do, and they all get behind each other. They can have this mob mentality. And the danger of this is when you realize that what you've done, the damage that you've taken, you get sobered up. And we'll see that later in this chapter, that you can get sobered up from your actions. And we need to be weary of not following the crowd, that not getting behind some sort of hype train or whatever everyone else is saying, but we need to be sticking to what is true and what we know to be right. And so we have this section, verses 26 through 38. We're going to read through 31. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him a cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people, and of the women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'to cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" So we see Jesus talking to these widows. So these widows here aren't probably followers of Jesus, but instead professional mourners, that they're just crying out on the streets. And Jesus, instead of taking on this sorrow and being like, "Yes, feel bad for me," instead goes, "Hey, really, you should be weeping for yourselves, for what's about to happen." That there's going to be conditions that I think Stephen went into detail about, of there's going to be temptations to have cannibalism and eat your babies and things that you would never want to be a part of. That's your future. That's what's coming for you in 70 AD. That is what awaits you, that you should be weeping for yourselves. That you'll just want everything to be over and the mountains to collapse and fall on you. That's what awaits you, that when Jesus is headed towards the cross, he's still worried about the people of Jerusalem. And then we get this imagery here. There's different thoughts on it. I'm going to give it the best go I have. In verse 31, it's interesting wording. It says, "For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" That Jesus is the green wood here, that he's strong. He's not meant for the fire of judgment. That when you have a live wood, you're not supposed to put it in a fire. It doesn't burn well. It's not its purpose. But then you have this dry wood that's supposed to represent Jerusalem. It's vulnerable. It's deserving of fire. That's its purpose, and that's what's coming. It's this contrast between the judgment of Jesus and the judgment of Jerusalem. Then we have this next section in verses 32 through 38. Two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place is called the Skull, they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said to them, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments. And the people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." So Jesus gets to the cross. He's going on his way. He comes to this place called the Skull. And again, Jesus, who he's concerned about is not himself, but the people. He says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. And then there's these things that happen, like casting lots on the garments, that are fulfilling prophecies. And people just begin to mock him in the inscription above his cross, mock him in what they're saying towards him, mock them in their actions. It's just filling of mocking Jesus while he's headed towards the cross. And I think one point to make here is through weakness comes strength. That this is a part of God's kingdom. That a big part of what they're saying and these mockings that are happening is talking about if he's really king, if he's really this person, then he would have more power than this. He would have more strength than this. But his strength is coming through his weakness. That's what the kingdom of God is about. That though those who are strong might look weak on the outside, but in reality are the strongest of them all. That through things like death, something that seems so weak, something so strong as life can come about. Now, that's the story of the cross. That's the story of how God uses his people. That's the story of the kingdom of heaven. And then we see that he's focusing on the souls here. That this is echoed later in Acts 7 with Stephen, that forgive them, they know not what they do. That he's so concerned on the things that are happening outside of him. We see this with the widows, or we see this with the weeping women. And then we see this here with the people, that he's so concerned about the people around him. He's so concerned about the crowd. He wants to forgive them. He wants them to be in the right place. And that's just hard for me to imagine, and maybe would be helpful to talk about. And maybe someone who has more life experience can say more about. That when we see Jesus here in the midst of trial and of persecution, having a concern for others, how do we cultivate a similar attitude that when we're in trials, we're still focused on the other people around us? Yeah, I think that's super interesting because I was out to lunch with some friends, and we were talking, and they were talking about different things going on in their life and different things that were going on with me and my other Christian friend. And they were like, well, we've known you guys for a couple years, and it's super interesting how you guys navigate things and how you guys navigate trials. It's just different. It doesn't really make sense to us. And that's not me patting myself on the back at all. But more of just like this idea that people do notice that. And I realized that this week, that how you navigate your hard situations, that people will compare it with how they navigate their own. And that is a way that you can shine your light. I think that's a really good point to make here. That Jesus is shining his light the brightest, that when he is getting persecuted the most, when he's on trial, literally the most you ever could be, in the most innocent circumstances you could be, he is shining his light. This is the moment where he has every right to, in our eyes, to do whatever he wants. Like, he's the most innocent, the most powerful, that he could be doing so many other things in this situation. And instead of what we would think or what we would do or what our natural reaction would be, he's instead here having this one instead. That forgive them, they know not what they do. Mm-hmm.
He has this faith to bring him through this. This is not about him. He's very sure about his destination. And so for us, when we're going through trials, how we cultivate that attitude is if you are positive and convinced of your destination, it's really not about you. It's about the people around you and helping them see that same destination.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really good. The confidence in our salvation can help us be outside focused and outwardly focused, and bringing people to that. That's a really good point, Wes. Any other thoughts before we move on? Cool. So we get to this next section where he has this conversation with the two thieves on the cross. And so we start in verse 39. One of the criminals who were hung railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." And the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." And so we see this image of Jesus on the cross, and we have two criminals beside him. And one criminal is saying to be railing on Jesus, to be saying, you could save yourself, you did all these great things, why don't you save us now? And the other criminal says, watch yourself. Watch yourself, because you're in the same situation as God right now. If you truly believe this person is God, you're in the same situation. And the difference between us and him is that we deserve this, and he does not. It's interesting, I never really realized this before. In Matthew's account of this situation, that both of the criminals on their way to the cross are reviling Jesus. That both are involved in mocking and reviling Jesus. And we see only one corrects himself. That one thief corrects himself. And so he corrects himself and says, hey, this Jesus guy, he's innocent. And I was frustrated. I was on my way to the cross, and I was saying, how could he do this? I know his power. I know he's God. And I was mocking with the rest of them. But he decides to correct himself and take a different path instead. And in taking that different path, he also has a different end goal. He has a different destination because of the different path that he's taken. And as we're living our lives, we need to understand that our destination comes from these self-corrections that we have. That we might be involved in the crowd and mocking Jesus, we might be reviling him, but we have opportunity to correct ourselves, and we need to take that opportunity to do so. And that is how we end up at a different destination. And I think this also, a big impact on this, is understanding our deservedness. That we deserve to be on the cross. That we deserve to be punished, but Jesus does not. And the reason that Jesus is on that cross is for us and to save us. That through Jesus being there in a state that we deserve and us not, Jesus has taken that upon himself, so that is not something that we have to do. That he's undertaken death so that we do not have to. And then we get into this phrasing, today you will be with me in paradise. This word paradise here is paradisos. It means garden. In the Septuagint, this is what would be replaced for the Garden of Eden, would be this word paradise. It's this image of where God dwells. That Jesus is inviting this man here into the garden. He's inviting him into the presence of God. He's inviting him into heaven. This is a promise of salvation. And if you think about everything on the outside of this image, on what it looks like for this thief, that if you were to ask, do I think that person is going to be saved? Well, he's tried before some sort of judge, and man has ruled that he does not deserve salvation, that he deserves death. That everything in his circumstances right now, he's on a cross, he's being beaten, brutalized, and he's being killed. That wouldn't suggest salvation, but instead it's God's words. It's God's words that you are going to be saved. And we should have confidence in that alone, that God says we are going to be saved. That man can say differently, that our circumstances can say differently. But if we're following God and we're doing what he asks us to do, that we can have confidence in his words. Eric?
So, when Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, the next story is one of these people being forgiven. And so I wonder if the thief on the cross heard Jesus saying that, and that's what starts to melt his heart or something. But earlier in some of the other Gospels, Jesus compares himself to a thief that comes into the strong man's house and binds up the strong man and steals back what always belonged to Jesus. There's something ironic, I think, going on here, that Jesus is the thief on the cross. He's the righteous thief that's stealing back from Satan what always belonged to him.
Yeah, that's really good.
And that, which would beg the question, has he stolen your heart?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Someone asked me about this last week when I told them I was going to do the crucifixion, and so I'm going to bring it up. And I think it's an interesting question. It's one you've probably heard before in talking to people. But the thief on the cross wasn't baptized. So why do I need to be baptized? You know, the thief of the cross was saved. It's Jesus' words, so why do I need to do this? And I think we can break this down in three ways. The first is they're still under the old covenant. Now, the new covenant hasn't been enacted yet. That it might have been written and being in development, but it hasn't been enacted. In Hebrews, it's compared to a will. So someone can write a will while they're alive, but it doesn't come enacted until they die. And so the same way here, they're not under the new covenant, but they're under the old covenant. He also could have been baptized. That Jesus' disciples were already baptizing people. There's some debate about what exactly that means, but they were baptizing people already. And it seems that the thief knows about Jesus and his claims and who he says he is. And so maybe there was a prior relationship. That would all be speculation, but it could be there, that there might have been a prior relationship and he'd already been baptized. And the final point is that this is a very unique circumstance. That if you're ever on a cross next to Jesus, then maybe this is okay for you as well. But we're only going to find two people ever in history that are going to be next to a cross with Jesus. And Jesus explicitly states his salvation. So I'd say these are three explanations on why the thief on the cross wasn't baptized, and three understandings that we can have. That they weren't under the old covenant, or they were still under the old covenant, that's what I mean. He could have been baptized, and that this was an extremely unique circumstance that I don't think anyone else is going to find themselves in. And then we get to this section, 44 through 49. It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, when the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. And now the centurion saw what had taken place, and he praised God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds that had assembled for this speculation, when they saw this, when they saw what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. So finally this happens. The earth itself is in itself groaning over this great sin, that the light is going out, the temple is torn in two, and Jesus commits his spirit over. That Jesus says that I commit my spirit over to you, and he dies. He breathes his last upon these words. And then we see the centurion, he pronounces Jesus' innocence. Once again, someone else pronounces that Jesus is innocent. And then everyone in attendance goes home, not everyone, some people in attendance go home beating their breasts, knowing they've done something wrong. And then you see this image of standing in a distance are the women of Galilee and his other acquaintances watching Jesus, the person they followed for so long, being put to death. And so the veil is torn in two. The darkness and this veil, they have purposes and reasons they happen behind it. I'm going to focus on this veil real quick. That this veil is woven and it has cherubim on it. So this is the temple veil, one that would be in the tabernacle as well. And it separates the most holy place from the holy place. And so it has these image of cherubim on it. And if you remember back in Genesis in the garden, that God puts these cherubim outside of the garden to make sure that Adam and Eve don't try to get back in. That he banishes us from the garden, he puts these guards in their place. And so in the same way, this veil is guarding the presence of God, the most holy place. And when Jesus dies, this veil gets torn in two. And so it's inviting us back into the presence of God. It's saying that through Jesus' death, we're able to enter into the presence of God itself. And so this invitation that today you'll be with me in paradise, today you'll be with me in the garden, is not just for the thief on the cross, but also for us, that we too can enter the garden because of Jesus' death. And that happens all in this tearing of the veil. And that is what it's representing. And then we see him yield up his spirit. That Jesus yields up his spirit. That although, yes, he gets put to death by the people, that it's his decision that ends up with him dying. And this is so weird and interesting that the Roman here, it's a reason for his confession. That he's seen many people die on this cross before. And you have to imagine, this is so unique. Usually they would have to break the legs of the people to make sure they would die. That people would be struggling through this. That people would be determined to try to stay alive as much as possible. And instead, Jesus just gives up his spirit. That Jesus decides to die. This is so strange to him that he knows something is different. Another gospel account says, truly this is the Son of God. And here it says, truly this man was innocent. And so we're seeing his innocence and his deity happening in this ability just to give up his own life. And then we get back to here. Like I said earlier, we need to be weary of mob mentality, of the crowd, of getting behind this cause. And we see this sobering up moment happen right here, where they go home and they're beating their breasts. And you have to imagine being at the cross, realizing I just put to death the Son of God, and being there, and I'd be beating myself too. And maybe I should be beating myself more because of how I put Jesus to the cross. But how they just had to wait without answer, that they didn't really know what was going to happen until you reach Acts 2. And there's this way of salvation, there's a way of making it right, your relationship with God. Even though you've done something to put him to death, you're able to be brought back into a relationship with him. And sometimes because we're not physically at the foot of the cross, we lose sight of this. That maybe we should be putting ourselves at the foot of the cross more and understanding that this is what we have done to Jesus. And that we have a way of escape through things like they did at Acts 2 of baptism and being able to enter into this relationship with Jesus once again. Eric?
It's also a way of showing, too, that whatever you think you're going to gain from sin, you're always going to regret it afterwards. You're always going to be gaining your breath. If you have a good conscience still, you're going to regret what you've done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, that sin is always promises more than it can give. We get to this final section, and for sake of time, I'm not going to read it, but I will explain what happens. So we get this guy named Joseph of Arimathea, and he gives up his grave in order that Jesus has a place to be buried. That we see Jesus' death here and now his burial, that he gives up his own grave, and he goes to Pilate and he asks for Jesus' body. They put it in this grave. They make sure to have all these spices on it. And the women are going to come back and constantly be renewing these spices to make sure the body doesn't stink while it's decaying. And so some things that we can see about this are first Joseph's side of this, that he's a member of the Sanhedrin and he thought Jesus was innocent. That not every single person in the Sanhedrin, this was not a collective view but a majority view. That we see people like Joseph and Nicodemus that thought otherwise. And what he's doing here is he's risking himself by going and asking Pilate for this body. That how we've seen so far, that Pilate's not afraid to be merciless and ruthless and to kill people, that Joseph is putting his own neck on the line by doing this. And also he sacrifices his own burial plot that were really expensive, especially one that would be like this, where it'd be like a cave that they've dug into and they put a stone over. That Jesus is the only one in this grave so far. And then we see different Jewish laws and customs here. The reason they have to do this in such a hurry is because if this body hangs on this cross, if it hangs on a tree, it's cursed. That's in Deuteronomy. That there's no embalming here, so they have to wrap the body in spices. That we see Nicodemus, he wraps 75 pounds of spices in Jesus' body. And they're hurrying because the Sabbath is coming soon, so they have to make sure they do this all before sundown. And so they finish this up, and they're going to come back, and the women are going to come back and continually, to honor Jesus' body, renew these spices. We see, it's interesting in the story of Lazarus, when he dies, in the fourth day, his body starts to stink. And so they're trying to be in this constant renewal where his body never gets to a place of dishonoring or disgrace or where people don't want to be around it. I think would be an image that's happening here. We have 1 minute. I'm going to say a quick prayer. I appreciate you guys listening, and then we'll be close. Dear God, thank you so much for this day that we can come together and worship you, that we can open up your word and learn about your death, Lord. That everyone from every angle thought that you were innocent, that you didn't deserve this death, but still, Lord, you took it on for us. That we know that you are a king, that it might not seem like that from the outside, in this situation, but Lord, you are showing your power here, that you are showing your ability to save us through this. And we thank you for that. We thank you for your death, Lord. Help us to be more like you in all that we do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.